I found all of you, the witnesses, to be offering us some very compelling testimony today, and I think the record of this hearing will be of great value to all of us, and to a great number of people who will be looking through this record. One major truism of our era is we are now living in a time that is different than it was 50 years ago, in that we have huge chunks of the world population that seem to be perched and ready to uplift their standard of living in India, especially in India and China. And we're talking about together, they represent maybe half of the world's population, I believe. And half of the world's population, which in the past seemed to be relegated to living the rest of eternity in poverty and deprivation. This will obviously, if indeed their well-being and their economic well-being is to be uplifted, that will it not, create a huge drain on natural resources. It takes energy to have prosperity for normal people. It takes clean water as well, I might add. And it takes industrialization, or at least the production of wealth using technology to uplift large populations. So thus we face a world now that is going to have, if indeed India and China are to increase their standard of living, this will create a major, it'll exacerbate everything we've been talking about today. And for example, Mr. Chow, you mentioned in your testimony the growing competition in Central Asia for Central Asian oil, and that India is part of this, for this oil and gas competition for that. There are different ideas, as we've heard testimony today, about pipelines that could then maybe connect India and China to this oil and gas in Central Asia. But any pipeline that would go through, or get to India from Central Asia, it seems that it would have to come through, and what's being looked at now as an Turkmenistan, Afghan, Pakistan, India pipeline, TAPI, I think they call it. And is that realistic, Mr. Chow, that they could have that? Is that pipeline really a pipe dream? Considering the fact that of what's going on in Afghanistan and the turmoil that pipeline would have to go through?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. I think in my written testimony, I made clear to you that I'm helping our Department of State on figuring out how to advance this pipeline project. And challenges for that project is indeed daunting for quite obvious reasons that we don't need to go into detail here. I think the fundamental reason why this might work, and I say might, is that you have a country in Turkmenistan that has the fourth largest gas resources in the world, that seeks diversification of its export routes so that it doesn't become over-reliant on China as it once was over-reliant on Russia for its natural gas exports. And at the same time, as you've already mentioned, we've got this booming energy market in India. If it's possible to connect the two, and geography dictates that therefore you have to go through Afghanistan and Pakistan, then there are fundamental ingredients that would make that project work economically if you can manage the political and security risks involved. So I think the economics are there, the interests of the government to seek alternative export routes is there. By the way, it converges rather well with U.S. national interests. in the sense that our interest in the stability of the region, in integrating Afghanistan into both South and Central Asian economies, and also to promote better relationship for Pakistan with its neighbors, most prominently India and Pakistan. So it's a very challenging project. I've worked in this industry for quite a long time. The fundamental economics are there. Whether politically and in terms of security it's achievable or not, we will have to find out.
So let's note that you're saying it's a challenging project, but it's not challenging engineering-wise, is it? It's the challenge has to do with political decisions and political stability and within Afghanistan and that region. India would certainly have a important, let's say, be an important customer for that oil, but at the same time, wouldn't that be a something that Chinese would not want to have developed?
I think that that's fair to assume.
So what we have is, Dr. Chow, is the great powers of that region, India and China, have conflicting interests over what to do with that natural resource. And again, that's what this hearing is all about. And we should take note of that and learn from it and maybe try to project what that means in the future. Do any of the other panelists have a comment?
I would just add, Mr. Chairman, if you permit me, that we should not underestimate the interests of the national leaders of the countries involved in Central Asia to balance their interests so that they're not overly dependent on any one of the regional powers. So they have a fundamental interest in diversity of export routes.
Yes, Mr. Brown.
Just maybe to add just a couple of thoughts to that, because you've hit on, I think, something that is both a positive and a negative in this world, which is, even just on a humanitarian basis, we want poor people to rise up out of poverty. Right. And who can blame them for wanting air conditioning and cars and all the sorts of things that we want?
Refrigerators are clean water.
Exactly. And in a ironic sort of way, when we see China, India, other emerging economies go out searching for these resources, it's an indicator of economic activity, which on the other side benefits the United States in terms of a strong trading partner where we can sell our goods and services. So it really is a double-edged sword. In my prepared testimony, I mentioned one manifestation of energy and conflict that we do see happening, and that is around the issue that you've raised, which is electrification and access to power. We see in countries like Pakistan, we just saw it in Egypt, where the inability of governments to provide such a basic resource as power can lead to instability that can then overthrow those governments and directly impact U.S. activities. That's why the work that Ed is doing on TAPI, there's also discussions that the World Bank is working on in electrification to bring from Central Asia. That's essential. There's also a huge multi-billion person market out there that U.S. companies can access to provide power. Whether that's from big stationary plants that might use coal or natural gas or renewables. It's much like the telecommunications and kind of personal goods, soaps and whatnot, industries found in emerging markets where these may be poor people, but they do have purchase power. And so unlike countries that just want to take natural resources, the U.S., we have a position to really invest and also make money in the trading relationships.
So let's hope that there will be some stability enough so that those natural resources, and that's what this is all about, will be able to be utilized to help human beings. If I was in India and I was trying to calculate what I should be doing to strategically, considering that they're what seems to be in an adversarial relationship with China and Pakistan, but China, it seems to me that I would want to help those elements in Turkmenistan and Afghanistan that might be willing to align themselves with India's interests. And again, this is talking about fundamental reasons for conflict. Mr. Mankoff, you mentioned the gas off of the Israeli coast. Would that gas, and we heard mention of Egypt a moment ago, would that gas be something that could be used for bringing peace between Egypt and Israel, and especially now that maybe you have a different potential direction for Egypt rather than the Muslim Brotherhood, an anti-Israeli government? Could perhaps Israel step forward and try to say that that gas could be used for Egypt as well in a peaceful endeavor?
Yes, thank you for your question. The fundamental challenges that face that part of the world are ultimately rooted in politics. And energy, I think, can play a role in addressing the conflicts between Israel and her neighbors, but in and of itself is not sufficient to do that. I think you have to have political agreements, political solutions to some of the problems between those countries, and energy can be a carrot or an inducement for reaching those agreements. There's been discussion in Israel about exporting some of this gas to Jordan, for example, though apparently that has now been caught up in internal
right now,
Israeli
Israel
politics.
is in negotiations on water
Yeah.
with Jordan, and especially about this has been going on for a few years now, between the Dead Sea to Red Sea, or the Red Sea to Dead Sea project, which has, there's been step by step, but they have been negotiating at a time when there are other factors were driving Israel and Jordan apart. They had this mutual interest in negotiating for water. Perhaps with Egypt and now in the situation that it is, and the government of Egypt is now in a precarious situation, perhaps this would be a good time to try to cement some positive ties based on economic dual interests. General, did you have a comment on those things?
No, sir.
Any comment on the Chinese part with Central Asia and the pipeline?
No, sir, that's not something that we covered in our report.
All right, thank you very much. I will now turn to my ranking member, Mr. Keating.
Well, thank you, Mr.